Yes, we are planning on recording it, and yeah, the reminder about public meeting is appreciated too. It is a public meeting. The link is on our website, and anybody's able to join this.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy, for that reminder for everybody. And let me start by asking our TAC colleagues to introduce themselves. So if I can start with Linda.
Yes, I'm Linda Poole, and I'm a teacher in the Papillion La Vista School District, and I'm also a 25-year board member on the Millard Public Schools.
Thanks, Linda. Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy Gray. I'm the Associate Superintendent for Elkhorn Public Schools, and that's about it.
Great, thanks, Cindy. Jeff.
Hi, good morning, everyone. A long time ago, I was a chemistry teacher in high school, and I worked for the Massachusetts Department of Education as testing director and deputy commissioner of education, and then with the Park Consortium as chief of assessment.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And Bob.
Good morning, or good afternoon for me, I guess, 12:07. But my name's Bob Henson. I'm a faculty member out of the Department of Educational Research Methodology, and I'm currently serving as the Associate Dean for the School of Ed at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro.
Great, thanks, Bob. And my name's Chad Buckendahl. I am with a small shop called ACS Ventures. And I am located just right now north of Philadelphia. So welcome, everybody. I should mention, though, I am from Nebraska originally. So if I throw in an occasional Husker reference like Go Big Red, beat Texas later today, that's for those of you who follow Nebraska sports will know what I'm talking about. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today, and for Jeremy and team from the department getting our meeting materials out to us in advance. Much appreciated. Very interesting discussions we're going to have today. And we just want to start again with one of the administrative pieces through review and approval of minutes from our last meeting. And so I want to give the TAC an opportunity to provide any comments for additions, deletions, or revisions to the minutes from our most recent meeting.
I move that we accept the minutes.
Thanks, Jeff. Do I have a second on that?
Second.
Second by Bob. Great. Any comments, discussion? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of the move to approve minutes as presented, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Any abstention? Hearing none, motion's passed unanimously. Thank you, everybody. All right, so jumping into our first, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. You are cutting in and out just a little bit. At least in mine, it's getting louder and quieter. I don't know if you can adjust at all, but I can still hear you the entire time, but it's kind of going in and out.
Okay, yeah, that's bad. That would be the sound card on my laptop, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
Let me, if the sound, Jeremy, if the sound continues to cause problems, I'll dial in from my phone for audio.
Okay.
And stay on video that way, just to not to cause issues, because it's been having this problem with this for like the last week now.
Okay.
Jeremy, sometimes it helps for everybody else to mute. Also, I had that problem this morning in a meeting.
Very good. Good point, Dr. Friesen. Thank you. Okay. So we should probably be okay, Chad, since you're not doing most of the presenting or whatever. So like I said, I could still hear you. It was just a little quieter at times. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for letting me know. And yeah, please feel free to shoot a chat at me in the chat box or something, or jump in if the sound quality is poor.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. So our first substantive topic today is on using principled alignment and item difficulty modeling to create an integrated hybrid interim summative through your adaptive assessment system, proof of concept and considerations. And NWEA provided some advanced materials on that. And so do we want to, I don't know, Christy and team, do you have a presentation for us, or what is the plan for talking through some of this? Excellent. Let me turn it over to you then.
Yeah, Christy and Jing are going to present some information, and then we can follow up with the questions.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 unmuting. Okay, so can you see the presentation and can you hear me?
We can,
Yep.
Thanks.
So Jing and I will be co-presenting today, and I believe we have about an hour on the agenda for discussion, and feel free, we have questions for the TAC at the conclusion of the presentation, but also please feel free to jump in with questions, concerns as we go through the process. So we're currently working with Nebraska to build a coherent assessment system between adaptive, summative, and interim assessments by merging these constructs together. And the reason for building this through-year system of merged constructs is to provide teachers stronger support in monitoring and understanding where a student is in the learning of their state standards. And our success criteria for this is that we're going to be satisfying the State Department of Education for the technical buy-in criteria, passing peer review, those fun things, while also supporting teachers and districts and having good assessment quality and interpretations to support learning and instruction. So the idea behind this is that range ALDs, which are range achievement level descriptors, can be a bridge that connects interim and the summative assessment systems because they describe the evidence that we need to draw a conclusion about where a student is in their journey to proficiency. And then the idea is that this is the state's theory of learning, and that we are aligning items specifically to those evidence statements to support having a coherent assessment system, because if we use the same types of evidence and standards interpretations to understand student learning from the classroom, from interim assessments to summative assessments, we have one compass to which we are working and driving towards. And so we're building increased educational systemic validity. So this is an example of the state's range achievement level descriptors, and this is an example from Nebraska's reading in 3rd grade. So you can get an idea of what they look like. So these are built to, in Nebraska, they're the indicators, and you see that there are progressions within each indicator because that is how Nebraska is designing their items. So I want to talk a little bit about how this connects to the notion in the learning science literature of learning progressions. You can find many different interpretations of what a learning progression is in the literature. What we believe and hypothesize is that range ALDs provide a deeper contextualization of learning progressions, and that they're really progressions of cognition as students grow in the state standards. And that no matter whether we're in the classroom or interim or summative assessment, that the evidence that teachers and item writers should be looking for as they understand where a student is in their journey to proficiency should be explicit in the range ALD achievement levels, so that teachers and item developers have the same types of evidence collection practices. And so we have everybody, again, that single compass. So in order to have this hypothesis, then what we're really doing is thinking about the range achievement level descriptors as the test score interpretations. So that's the interpretive argument, if we think about Kane's framework, regarding what the scores mean. And then in addition to having an interpretive argument about what scores mean, we also need to have a validity argument where we're showing that these achievement level descriptors are in fact doing what we want them to do. And so we're taking a page from Jen et al. And 5 stages of building a learning progression validity framework. And so this is the framework that they developed to validate learning progressions. And we're going to be referencing this as we go through the process today in terms of thinking about the progression development. So building learning progressions in a state assessment is a little bit different than our historical practice of thinking about alignment as being alignment of an item to a state standard and to a state to a DOK level. What this is looking to do is to expand the meaning of alignment to this test score interpretations and to that learning progression. So if you can identify where a student is in the progression based on the score interpretations, which are the range ALDs. So if you can align to a cell, that then helps you to then align to the standard because it's showing you how to also interpret that standard for assessment and for alignment to the standards. So one of the things that we want to think about is that in the range ALD framework that we've been using in Nebraska, the idea is that you're building in increases in content difficulty, cognitive demand as defined by DOK, and then also context. And then the notion of context is the way that we define it in the progression of the range ALDs. It's the conditions under which a child can show you what they know in the state standards. What do they need to be successful? So you can think about that sometimes as being scaffolding. You can think about that perhaps as being visuals and understanding where a child is if they can only respond to items that have visuals versus if they're able to visualize, for example, the attributes of the geometric figure and use that in their internal thinking to solve a problem without that being present. So that would be a notion of what context means. So when we think about this from a perspective of building an adaptive test that is designed to support teaching and learning and also accountability, we want to make sure that we're not treating from our perspective item features that are intended as difficulty drivers as a constraint. Now this idea of building blueprints centered on depth of knowledge and domains and item types comes from our practice of building fixed form assessments, where you want to ensure that all students have an opportunity to show what they know and they have access to rigorous content on the state summative assessment. And all of that is true and good and important in a fixed form paradigm. When we move to building a computer adaptive test and we constrain on elements of tasks that may drive difficulty, we are unintentionally not allowing the algorithm to be as efficient as possible because we are giving students items that are potentially too difficult or too easy because of we need to hit some of these constraints. So the way we adapt is not to say that we don't want to give all students the opportunity for rigorous content. Where you have to show that you have rigorous content is in your item pool. So you have to show that what you would build as your fixed form constraints or your blueprint, your item pool has to meet that. And then the idea is that if the item pool has a sufficient percentage of items for each measurement target across the range of achievement, and we're seeing increases in cognitive demand within measurement targets across achievement levels, then what we're seeing is students have an opportunity to access that content if that's where their ability is, and we're allowing the notion of progressions to come in and also influence the development of items. So we can better say where a student is now in their thinking on their journey to proficiency and above. And so this is really, we're putting together then the idea of what do we need to do to have robust score interpretations to serve accountability? What do we need to put into place, because this is an adaptive assessment, to meet our historical requirements for accountability and peer review? But what do we change in our thinking paradigm through the showing of evidence that we can make the assessments more supportive for teaching and learning in terms of building in those progressions?
Christina, does this require you to have a much larger item pool than you would normally have? Because it sounds like you're really, within a standard, there could be a range of difficulty, a range of complexity, right?
That's right. That's right.
So what you're trying to do is to cover that,
Yes,
because
sir.
so to me, it sounds like you have to build a much larger item pool than perhaps in a more traditional or conventional, even adaptive test. Is that what you're finding?
So I would say the yes and no, or yes and. So I would say if you want the item pool to measure progressions of learning versus just proficiency, then you have to have the items in all of those cells, right? In the way that you would for a fixed form, to meet those accountability targets. What we're seeing is that at minimum, in some of the analyses that we're running, depending on the length of each assessment, so we're thinking about a through a year being 3 administrations in the beginning, that we at minimum need around 800 items to do this, if the pool meets these specifications. So, and if the pool doesn't meet specifications, or if you have more numbers of items in different parts of the scale, then you're going to need more items, because we don't have that statistical and content specification. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
So the theoretical strategy that we're working on here is bridging the ideas about what we love about the interim assessments with what we also love and need from the summative assessments. And we're going to do that through the theoretical strategy of item difficulty modeling. What item difficulty modeling does is it takes task features that are expected to predict item difficulty along the test scale, and we run linear regressions that Jing will be talking about, and then we document whether or not those features that are hypothesized to influence item difficulty actually do so in reality or based on evidence. So we want to do this because we think it's good validity evidence, but we also think that this is a strategy that we can evaluate construct comparability between interim assessments and summative assessments. And if they are not the same, and it's reasonable to think that they might not be because they're built for different purposes, can we link together the two assessments without using common items and common students, but through using common features of items to find out which items are optimal to use to create this hybrid interim summative assessment system to the state's theory of learning. So we are going to go over, in essence, 3 different research studies that we've engaged in looking at this. So the first critical piece that we have to look at is, do range ALDs to task matches, like, are range ALDs basically a significant predictor of task difficulty? We've been talking about since 2012 that we think this happens, but do we have evidence? Then we want to say and look at if the summative and interim assessments can be linked to develop coherent inferences about where students are in their learning in ways that do not rely on common students and common tasks. Very different from our typical summative approaches to linking, but I think useful in this context. And we're going to do this in 2 different ways. One is through social moderation, which Bob Lynn talked about in the 1990s as a way of linking inferences from assessments, where the range ALDs establish the performance standards and the teachers are using those to have common paradigms of what it means to be proficient. And then the second is through research from Miss Levy and colleagues that is centered in linking assessments using collateral information. But you need these following assumptions: that you have an IRT model, that you have available collateral information about test items and the management systems that are correlated to item difficulty parameters, and that we've got robust numbers of items to model. And so the key here is that we have robust amounts of information to engage in a study like this. And I will say that that's important because I've done this with fixed form assessments and found very different answers using 40 or 50 items on a form versus the data we're going to show you where we have 3,000 items to look at. So, and then the next part of this is for study number 3, if we determine that range ALD to task matches do model item difficulty, can we then use that to optimize which items from the interim assessment are best integrated with the summative theory of learning to put the system together for this hybrid interim summative systems? And so Jing will be talking a little bit more about this, but we're really focusing on the DOK level, the depth of knowledge, the range ALD achievement level from the state, the item types, grade, calculators, and standards. How do they work in combination to describe items? And so now I'm going to be turning this over to Jing to take us through the analysis.
Okay. Hi, I will talk about the research method and the results from this study. First, for the data, we used math items from a summative assessment and interim assessment, about 3,000 items from each assessment. So these items are coded for the item feature variables like range ALD, DOK, standard, item type, etc. So we use the same coding schemes to code the summative and the interim items. So the item features are comparable across the items from the 2 assessments. For the item pool, the summative and interim item pool have different characteristics. For example, the summative assessment has about 70% of multiple choice items, but the interim assessment has 90% of multiple choice items. And the summative assessment has about 9% polynomous item. The interim assessment does not have any polynomous item. So the item pool characteristics are slightly different across summative and interim assessments. When we want to merge them into a hybrid interim and a summative item pool, we need to be very careful because the difference of the item pool characteristics may indicate that these assessments may measure slightly different constructs. When we want to merge them into a hybrid interim summative item pool, we need to be careful. So that's the data. And then next slide, please.
I want to say, in this context, we're saying we want to be careful because of the constructs, because until the state changes its standards, we don't want the state to have to go back to peer review if possible. We want to keep the standard setting cut scores historically in the state's construct for that reason. And Jeremy can talk a little bit more about the standards, but I want to just give that context really quickly before we switch slides.
And can you just confirm that when you talk about the summative, we're talking about NCAT, the Nebraska summative assessment, not some other summative?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Then the item metadata are the item features. For the summative math items, they were tagged for these item feature variables by content specialist from a vendor. And for the interim items, they were tagged for these item feature variables by panels of teachers. And these teachers were trained by the content specialist from NWEA and the vendor to follow the same coding approach used for the summative items. So this is try to make the item features comparable across summative and interim items. And in the coding process, they were training, calibration, validation, and a back read process to issue the quality of the codings and the agreement between readers. Next slide, please. Then after we get the codes, the item feature codes, we began the model building. We applied an ordinary least squares linear regression model to model the difficulty of items. And in the model, the dependent variable is item feature. The dependent variable is item difficulty parameter, and independent variables are the item features. We use the 6 item features, range ALD, DOK, grade level, the target standard of the item type, and whether the item allows a calculator. So the first 3 variables were treated as ordinal variables, and the rest 3 variables were coded as dummy variables. So that's the model we applied to model the item difficulty. Then we use the 3 approaches to build the item difficulty models. The first approach is to train the model and validate the model using summative items only. The second approach is to train and validate the model using interim items only. In these 2 approaches, either the summative or the interim items were randomly split into training and validation data sets. So the training data set is used to train the model, validation data set used to validate the model. And the random splitting process was repeated 10 times. And the evaluation results are the average from the 10 cross-validation data sets. Then in the third approach, we built the model using summative items, but applied the model to the interim items. So this is try to put the to integrate the difficulty of the summative items and interim items and put the difficulty of those items on the same scale. So it's a way to link the difficulty of summative and interim items together and do not rely on the common student or common item approach. In real settings, oftentimes the difficulty of interim items are not available. So this is an approach to predict the difficulty of interim items. So we can use the model from the summative items to predict the difficulty of interim items. Okay, then I'm going to show you the results. First is the reader agreement. This is just the results to see whether the item features are coded reliably, whether these features are reliable. The readers coded range LD DOK standard, and we looked at the reader agreement using the validity sets and the read behind items. The validity set shows the agreement between teachers and their content experts. The read behind items shows the agreement between two teachers. So like the first table is the agreement from the validity sets for range LD. So the agreement, that agreement is 58.4 between teachers and content experts. And then the agreement between two teachers for the read behind items is about 57.2. And here we listed the agreement, that agreement for DOK and a standard from validity and read behind items respectively. So this agreement is all around like 50 to 60 percent. Though they are not as high as we would hope, but I want to emphasize that readers need to assign an item to the right LD, range LD level to the right standard. So there are about 30 standard. So the reader need to assign an item to about one about 90 cells. So it's not just assign an item to one of those three levels. So it's a much harder task, and that explains why the agreement is not so high. And for the current study, we adopt these ratings and conduct this study as a proof of concept. But in the future, it might more training might improve the agreement. Any question? Okay.
Jing, sorry. Yeah, this is Chad. Could you go back go back one slide for just a moment? It does look like there was, and again, this may be grade dependent, but it looked like for fifth grade in both the tables that you noted there, that seemed to be particularly challenging. Like, I mean, just it looks like about 42% in the first table, 40% in the second. Any thoughts or comments around that? And in seventh grade in the second set for the read behind, but the other ones seem to be right around that 60%. But there that jumped out at me, I guess, as something that seemed unusual.
Yeah, I think it can be like either the item of that grade is challenging, or because of the readers that code the fifth grade items, they have some reader errors. Not like at every grade level, there's about you can see the number of readers, maybe 10 readers. If the one or two readers are performing pretty bad, then that would influence the agreement statistics. So it can be either the item or facts from the readers, and we need to look at the data more closely to see what caused the low agreement.
And I would say there's a tension, I think, in the summer of doing this a little bit quickly and not being able to work with readers if they're having as much trouble as we would like. So I don't know if you would have recommendations for, so I believe what we did was they had 10 or 15 training, 15 calibration, and then they had the read behinds, and then they scored some together. But if you have recommendations for how we would proceed when we see this type of evidence during the rating.
Well, so Christy, maybe the related question is in terms, and I might have missed it, but were these 6 separate panels, or were there panels doing grade 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or there? So the grade 5 panel may have just been an issue with the grade 5 panel individually as compared with it wasn't the same people that were looking at an adjacent grade level.
That's correct. It was per panel.
Okay.
One of the, sorry, Mary, just say, one of the things I'd be interested is, right, was there one pair or one individual that had a high level of, disagreement or those types of things to see if there was additional training or those types of things. But it's a good point, Chad, in general, to call that out. Mary, what were you saying?
I was just going to clarify, we had 15 training. We had 2 different rounds of calibration. We also had validity and read behind. So there were 4 different sets plus the read behind.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, so thanks for the additional clarification. So that's helpful. And sometimes too, the standards themselves, which then by extension, the ALDs at 5th grade, because of that being kind of oftentimes the end of the elementary and transitioning then to middle school, depending on the system. I thought maybe the standards might have something to do with that. And then I was also curious around the adjacent in terms of looking at exact versus adjacent. Was there anything systematic about the adjacent? So like when you're looking at ALDs, were they always going higher? Were they always going lower? Was there any sort of observation of pattern? Because if you're talking about an ALD, there's kind of a limited degrees of freedom on that, and with DOK as well, as opposed to the standard. There's a lot more potential for, there's less potential for chance agreement for a standard level of agreement than there are for a range ALD or a DOK, where there's not that many choices. So did you notice anything systematically where the panelists were either like going to the ALD above or below? Jean, I don't know if you noticed that.
So this is a special study conducted by Admetric, and there's more details in their report. And I don't have on top of my head the pattern of adjacent, whether it's consistently higher or lower, but I can definitely look into that and see if there's any patterns in terms of the mismatch and how we can improve the rate agreement in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then for next slide, please. And then we have 3 study purposes. First one is range ALD, a good predictor. So we look at the relationship between range ALD and item difficulty. The correlation is about 0.4 for both summative and interim items. And this is here is a box plot that shows the how the item difficulties for items at different range ALD levels. So as you can see, when the range ALD level increased, the item difficulty generally increased. So this is the general pattern. And next slide, please. So these are the box plots at each grade level. So the same pattern is observed at each grade level. So at each grade level, when range ALD increase, the item difficulty also generally increase. And also when the grade level increase, the item difficulty also increase. So this box plot shows the impact from range ALD and a grade level on item difficulty. So we think range ALD should be a good predictor to be included in the model. So the second purpose is to determine if the summative and interim assessment will be linked to develop a coherent coherent inferences about where students are in their learning in ways that do not rely on common students or common tasks. So basically this is using item difficulty models to link the summative and interim items and put them on the same difficulty scale. So we used the 3 approaches to build models. For the first and second approach, using summative items or interim items respectively to build models. And we find the R-square is was 0.6 using the summative items and was 0.57 using the interim items. And this table shows the range of the R-squares from those 10 cross validations. So it's basically around 0.6. And then the R-square, when we use the summative item to build a model, but apply model to interim item, the R-square decreased to 0.45. And the decrease was not unexpected because we know the summative and interim item were designed for slightly different purposes, and they have item pool characteristics are different. So the item feature may slightly different across the 2 assessments, and they are calibrated using different procedures. So it's not unexpected, but generally it still provides some prediction of the item difficulty. Then we look at, because we use the linear regression model, we evaluate whether it's appropriate to use linear regression model and whether the data meets the linear regression model assumptions. So like this residual plot shows the residuals are have constant variance across the range, randomly scattered across the center line of 0, independent of each other and normally distributed. So, and also this, the second scatter plot shows the predicted difficulty versus the empirical difficulty. So generally you can see a linear pattern between these 2. So we think the linear regression assumptions are met, and it's generally reasonable to apply a linear regression model to fit the data. Then we notice some data points have large residuals, and these data points may have strong influence on the linear regression model and make the model do not perform as well as it should perform. So we want to examine the influence from individual observations on the model. We calculate the Cook-D and use that measure to identify potential outliers and to identify those potential the observations that have strong influence on the model. So in literature, there are different standards to identify outliers. If we adopt a standard of 4/n, where n is the number of the observations, then this red line represent the threshold, and we will identify about 5% of the items as outliers. So currently we are still examining these outliers to see if they need to be excluded model to improve the model prediction. So any question here?
I'm just whenever you say that they are being investigated, what types of things are you looking at? And the reason I'm asking is I'm wondering if an explanation for them to be outliers is because some of the independent variables that are being used, where you had multiple raters, if maybe the raters, those were the ones where the raters were most inconsistent. You know, like, are they causing the problem? And in something like that, then that in some ways just suggests maybe it's the independent variables that are not the problem, but the thing that as they get refined, they are still a reasonable tool to predict the.
Yeah, that's very good suggestion. Currently, I'm looking at the descriptives of the independent variables, like what are the item type of these outliers, and what are the range ALD level, DOT level of these outliers. So I find that like 20% of these potential outliers are the gap match items. So which may indicate like this model is not working very well for gap match items. And you suggested like the rater's rating is another thing to look at. If the items do not have consistent good ratings from the raters, these items may need to be excluded. So these are the ways we try to look at the outliers. Then current models still included these items. So that's the next step for us to see if we can improve the model prediction. Then we look at the predictors. We want to know what makes the items easy or difficult. And these are the tables, the coefficient tables from the summative items and from the interim items, respectively. And these tables shows you the coefficients and whether the variables, the independent variables are significant or not. Like for the summative model, we find here 5 significant predictors. For both of these models, I didn't both of these tables I didn't include standards because there are over 100 standards, so it's too big to show it here. And for the variables included here, there are 5 significant predictors at a grade level, range DOT, range ALD, DOT, multiple choice, and whether the item allows a calculator or not. These are the significant predictors. The red box are the predictors that have positive coefficients, which means they generate increased item difficulty. And the predictor in the blue box are the predictor that have a negative coefficient, which means it generates decreased item difficulty. So like a multiple choice item, they have lower difficulty compared to other item types. So these are the patterns of how the predictors impact the item difficulty. Okay, next slide, please.
And Jing, I'm sorry, before you move on from that, the additional item types that are being used, so the choice multiple, the composite, the gap match, etc. Are those? And again, I'm making a prediction here. Are those item types largely used to try to get to the higher levels of DOK, or to? I guess what I'm asking is, are you surprised that the multiple choice item type had a negative coefficient compared with the other item types, but aren't the other item types kind of intended to try to get to higher order thinking or higher levels of DOK? And because of the relationship between, say, the range ALD and the DOK, what isn't that already kind of expected? So were you surprised by that?
That's a very good question. I think I'm thinking about Mary may able to answer this better, because from content perspective, when you develop these item types, what's your purpose?
Yes, so I don't think that was a surprise. I know that that's something that Christy had brought up very early on in development of NSCAS, especially for the ones developed specifically for Nebraska, because that's where we were targeting our development as much as we could. So yes, I agree that other item types are usually where we're going to see those higher DOKs or increased difficulty depending. But we also do have to try to develop some multiple choice or other item types that can be scored on paper as well, to make sure we're meeting kind of the requirements for students who require that accommodation. So we weren't surprised, but we do try to keep those other requirements in mind as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess the reason I wanted to highlight that as part of the conversation here is because I think there is a general misnomer that multiple choice items automatically mean that the items are easier, or they can't get to some of those higher order thinking skills, and that these data would suggest, well, if it's a multiple choice item, the item difficulty is going to be easier. But I think that's actually, in this case, it's part of the design that had the other item types not been there, there's not necessarily a contrast then for the item type to be a predictor if all the questions were multiple choice. So I guess all that to say, I wouldn't want the message to be that, oh, if it's a multiple choice question, it's easy. And I worry about that a little bit from a public perception.
And I agree with that. And that's why we try to target other, target multiple choice for some of those higher level where we can, just because we know we still need to meet, for example, paper forms, all of that, we do need to try to get there. It's just that based on what we're seeing in the data. So for example, something like a choice multiple, where they're having to identify more than one thing, that is showing to be more difficult than multiple choice, right? Because they're having to identify multiple things. And I think that's something that I know Christy and Jing have looked at as part of this. So I agree with you, absolutely, because item type isn't the only predictor of difficulty, in the same way DOK isn't the only predictor of difficulty. So we do have some that are CCR, though, that are multiple choice, just like we have some TEIs that are developing.
Other members of the TAC, any other questions on this particular slide? And there's kind of a lot there to.
So one thing quickly, Chad,
Yeah.
So would it also help us probably to show, in addition to this information when we're sharing it, to make sure that maybe additional information that shows the range of difficulty for the multiple choice items, so that misinterpretation is avoided to some level?
I think that's particularly useful, and I would think other members of the TAC. I mean, I'm thinking Linda from the policy and the school district perspective, Cindy from a school administrator perspective, Jeff from working, multi-state consortium, Bob from communicating with folks. What are your thoughts around Jeremy's comment there? I tend to think it would be useful.
Yeah, we can produce that, like for different item types, what's the range of the what's the range ALD distributions?
Yeah, I think something like that will probably be really helpful, just because it's going to be really easy to overinterpret these weights based on the fact that it's a relatively complex model. So it's really given all these other things, that's the effect of multiple choice. And I think if you're reporting out these weights, anyone who's less familiar with the linear regression, you start saying, oh, look, multiple choice actually causes things to be easier, then it might be an oversimplified statement. So providing marginal tables and things that just kind of describe what's going on in the data set will help soften that impact.
Mm-hmm. To that point, do you think it would be useful to kind of show how a multiple regression model works for an item, so that you can see that, for example, that you might start with the constant, and then if you think about that you're building features into items that are interactions with each other, then you could say, okay, if you have a multiple choice item, and then it's at this grade, and it's at this DOK, this is kind of and it has a calculator, this could be the predicted difficulty of it, and kind of show them how it's working in combination? Or do you think that's too complex for lay audiences?
For me, I think it depends on the group. It's one of those to where in cases like this, I'm usually thinking in terms of, if I get too much in the weeds, am I going to have to get even farther into the weeds because they're going to ask for even more explanation, versus kind of this global, hey, look, we found some nice predictors, just be careful interpreting the weights. because understand there's a lot going on in this thing. It's describing average effects, which means it doesn't apply to a specific multiple choice. And then like those marginal tables might be just enough. Now, if I was presenting this to someone to where they are a down in the weeds type, and I know they're going to want to know it, then being ready for it and presenting it in the way you described is the way I would go, so that I'm the one presenting it as opposed to them asking questions that take me there.
I think most people at the district level are not going to dig down, but there are a couple districts that will dig down that far. I think that maybe the more critical one was back on your inter-rater reliability. I don't think it was clear exactly what the number of decision points were. And I know my immediate reaction was, are we just connecting to performance levels, which would be three decision points? So I think some clarification could be added there. In this point, for this particular chart, I think there are only a couple districts that will dig that deep.
What is your perspective on the difference in impact for the targeted grade of the item versus the range achievement level descriptor designation? Is that something that we need to pay close attention to?
Did you ask that, Christina?
What is your perspective on the impact of targeted grade on item difficulty versus range ALD achievement level? So, because what you can see is for the interim, the grade level also influences for the summative, the grade level influences the item difficulty, but it appears not quite as much on average as whether it's the range ALD descriptor versus in the interim where the targeted grade is not related necessarily to the item difficulty. And how, if we're thinking about an integrated assessment system across, are there any interpretations we should be tying or not tying with these tables in terms of thinking about going on or off grade?
I'm gonna have to think about that, Christina. Again, I don't know how many people that I know will dig this deep. They will ask questions about, do we have, what I'm hearing more would be questions about sufficiency to really make decisions about students. Questions about, if you've only got 10 items that are out of the grade level, is that really enough to make any kind of decision about where a student should be moving forward, and what's the level of error with that? So that's more the level of question I would hear.
That's helpful, Cindy.
Christina, were you asking your question because you're wondering if the construct is similar enough between the two? Like if grade actually predicts item difficulty for the summative, but grade doesn't predict item difficulty for the interim, are you asking, does that actually suggest that the construct is different enough between the two? Is that what you were asking, or just more on kind of the interpretation, whether or not there's a concern?
Well, there is a hot debate in the field, I would say, in terms of whether it is best for students to stay on grade or whether kids should be allowed to go off grade to find one, to measure growth, and two, is it an equal, you have debates on both sides about social justice and equal rights, whether you're saying kids should predominantly receive instruction on grade or whether kids should be allowed to go off grade to measure what they know and to diagnose where they are in the learning and what they need to grow. So given that paradigm, do these data speak to you in any way for any of those kinds of interpretations or to help with that, or you would stay away from any of those kinds of interpretations?
You know, and this is just my personal opinion. This always gets dangerous, but I don't know that these results speak to that paradigm. So what this speaks to is whether or not the constructs seem to suggest that they're the same. So it's really encouraging that most things are consistent between the two. So the way you predict item difficulty is about the same. And then that targeted grade versus not, that's just a little bit of evidence suggesting that maybe they're not quite the same. And so that's how I would interpret it. Now, I don't know that it speaks to whether or not I should allow a person to get off grade. And so that's how I would describe it, is that this provides, in my opinion, this provides more evidence that the two constructs are at least similar, and provides a little bit suggesting that there might be something a little different here with that targeted grade. And then for me, how different are they? Like maybe an effect size or something could also help suggest how big is that difference between the targeted grade versus not, as opposed to just significance. That might be something that comes in there, because you might find that even though it's significant, it's really a small effect size.
Yeah. All right, Jane, do you want to keep moving forward unless someone else has a comment or question?
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the last study purpose is determine if range ALD to task match to the item difficulty model could be used to determine if the interim task item could be optimized to support a single integrated approach of alternating summative and interim purposes. So this is use the item difficulty model to predict the item difficulty for interim items and use those predicted item difficulty to select interim items to fill the item pool gaps of integrated summative and interim item pool. Next slide, please. So because the model can predict the difficulty of interim items to some extent, then we use the predicted item difficulty to guide the selection of interim items as candidates for field testing to fill the item pool gap. Like this table here shows the for integrated summative and interim item pool, what's the sample size, what's the required sample size, and where are the gaps. For example, for the number reporting category, we need 65 items at range LD level 2, because the summative items, summative item pool is not big enough. So we need to select some items from the interim item pool. And for the interim item pool, we can select items in this way. The interim items are classified by teachers or content experts into the range LD levels. And we can also use those predicted item difficulty to classify these interim items into range LD levels. We have the cut points from the summative assessment, and based on those cut points and based on the predicted item difficulty for the interim items, we can classify them into range LD levels. Like we have 19 items that teachers classify them as level 2, and the predicted item difficulty also classifies them as level 2. So in this way, these items are more likely to meet the range LD requirement based on both teacher's judgment and based on the predicted empirical difficulty. So we have stronger evidence that these items is at level 2. So in this way, we can fill the item pool gaps and then select the best possible field test items, because field test slots are precious. We want to select the most appropriate field test items. Okay, next slide. So our conclusion is the model can produce acceptable predictions for summative items, interim items, and when it's applied, when it's trained on summative applied to interim, the prediction is slightly lower. But when we considering these interim items will be embedded into the summative items in a hybrid item pool, then the prediction might be higher than 0.45. Then for the predictors, range LD is a strong positive, has strong positive impact. The multiple choice item type has a strong negative impact. So overall, these item features can be used in combination to better understand where the item is likely to be on an IRT scale. So implications, if we want to design more difficult items and provide students more learning opportunities, we may consider item types that beyond the multiple choice type and items at higher DOT levels and higher range AOD levels. So the predicted item difficulty can be compared with the target range AOD level as a quality control check. So we can see whether the items are likely to perform at the designed range AOD level. So it's checking whether the whether items are designed well before we collecting any field test data, whether it's going to perform at the design difficulty level. So we have 3 questions for TAC members. The first is about the outliers. What do you think the criteria should be to exclude the potential outliers to improve the model prediction? Second is because we find item type has impact on difficulty. We currently do not tie item types to item specifications for range LD statements. Does evidence support a move to do so? The third question is the summative and formative items may measure slightly different constructs, and what should be the rule of incorporating the different constructs that are present? So any suggestions or questions here?
Jing, before asking the TAC to weigh in on these specific questions, could you go back, I think it's 3 or 4 slides to the second to last table before your conclusion? One more, that one right there. Or, sorry, 1 forward. Sorry, 2 forward. No, sorry. So that's going backwards. So go forward towards the conclusion discussion. 1 more, there, right there. So I just want to, because one of the questions is kind of related to, I think, some of the information from this. I just want to make sure that I understand the item pool gap analysis here. In looking at this, I looked at this and said, right now, the items in the pool really only support making a decision between levels 1 and 2, that there really aren't items that are really targeting level 3 across the domains, whether summative or interim. And I just want to make sure that or at grade 3, I just want to make sure, is that a valid interpretation of these data, or is this not showing a complete picture? And I know this is just for grade 3, but.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we currently don't have a lot of level 3 items. We plan to develop more items at a higher range LD levels. So currently, the majority of the items are at level 1 and 2. So this is just a way to find more items, to find a more useful item from the interim assessment to fill the gap of the item pool as much as possible. But I understand we still need more items at level 3 to achieve the purpose of differentiating between level 2 and level 3.
Carrie, do you want to talk to this a little bit?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Chad was asking, so Chad, observation is that currently in the pool, we don't have sufficient numbers of items to really get high precision for those top performing students. And so he was asking if this is a good representation of the pool. And so I was wanting to see if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Sure, and Christy, just to make sure the table that we're looking at includes all of our operational items, not just the Alignment City items from this past summer.
This is our operational items from the summative on the left hand. Yes, ma'am.
So I think once we get field test data back from our current administration of the field test, hopefully that will fill some of those gaps. We have had limited field test opportunities in the past due to needing those spots for other things. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll get some additional items that target those levels. That is what we prioritized when we selected field test. However, we also know that this is a unique year in terms of assessment. So we'll have to keep an eye on that in terms of the data as well. But I do think this is accurate in terms of the data. But I think it will improve after this field test this year.
And again, recognizing that what's on screen is only showing for grade 3. I don't know if that, I don't know if we can extrapolate from that to the other grade levels, but I guess, and you don't have to answer it right now, but the comment that Cindy made a little while ago about the field potentially looking at some of that inter-rater agreement information and then potentially raising questions about that, recognizing that most of the items are targeting level 1 and level 2 at the range ALD and level essentially DOK1 and DOK2 on the DOK level, those agreement levels actually then are probably a little more concerning because the probability of chance agreement was even higher given that that there wasn't an expectation of a uniform distribution of all those conditions. There weren't really 9 cells to anticipate agreement coming from. There was probably 4 cells, level 1, level 2, and then DOK1, DOK2. So some of the additional opportunities for disagreement likely weren't there. So just for what it's worth, and that's where looking at some of any sort of kind of systematic pattern disagreement, I think might be useful for additional item development there. But again, just a few observations, but Jing, please go ahead and I don't know if other members of the TAC had comments related to this particular chart or thoughts around the specific questions that NWA is asking us to look at. And if so, Jing, please feel free to advance the slides then to the slide where you have those questions. Let me open it up to the TAC for thoughts.
I think one comment I have is related to the outliers. I would say whether or not they should be excluded, before I excluded them, I would think about whether or not there are other variables you should be collecting that would describe the items. So it's possible that they are different from the others in a very specific way that's not being modeled, but could be modeled. And I don't know, so it's one of those things where be careful. I wouldn't go down the rabbit's hole too far. You could spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what makes item difficulty predictable. So I wouldn't spend too much time, but I would spend at least a little time to say, well, is there a reason? Because your outliers may actually be similar for some reason. And if there is, then you could find it. And then if you're not able to find it and you can't figure out any other reason why they're misbehaved, then I would say, well, maybe. And I know that's not a good answer. I'm always cautious to exclude things from analyses, but I do think that if you really kind of walk through all this and you have just a few items that are causing you trouble, then it might be worthwhile to drop it. Another thing, just as a side comment, I think this is a really neat way to compare these two different assessments. So the idea of modeling item difficulty based on something else and then bringing the interim to the summative using that model is a really neat idea.
Yes, thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, I seem to, it's like 100 outliers, and it's a much smaller scale compared to looking at the 3,000 items. So we can definitely look closer to these items and think about if there's any features causing these items different from the other items, and influence the prediction of the model. It's we conduct this study as a proof of concept to see if this is a good way to select few test item for the through-year approach. So it does not rely on other more complicated linking approach. So it's like a proof of concept study.
And now, is the ultimate plan after you bring some of these items over, will you also continue to pilot them and then get an estimate of their item parameter, or will you always use the predicted item parameter, or kind of like that rescaled difficulty?
And as soon as they get onto the NSCAS scale, we would use the N from the calibration within. So this is really just to say, you are trying to write items to different areas of the scale. We know that that's a challenge from the research literature. So if we can get early feedback to guide us so that we're more efficient in the process. And then what would be the next step, I think, would be calibrating items on the scale and then comparing, like, how did it work? That would be the next, I think that's the next stage of this.
Okay. Because a different study, but what occurred to me is it would be interesting to see how different the theta estimate is when you use the predicted item difficulties versus the observed item difficulties. And you may have the data there, but based on what you just described, that's less relevant, right? Because you're using it as a way to identify those items that probably behave well or that you would need. And so I don't know that those types of questions need to be addressed. But I mean, you've got some fairly high correlations in some of these. And so you might find that the predicted model does reasonably well and that your thetas don't change too much. But like I said, that's more of a, that's a sidebar type of thing, I think.
Yeah, that's a way to validate our approach for the future.
Yeah, and it gives you something, it's an easier way to interpret that 0.45 for the R squared. Like I hear 0.45 and I'm like, well, I mean, it depends on the setting. That could be small or it's larger than some of these cases, but then it may end up being that it doesn't really change your theta estimate that much. And then all of a sudden it starts to feel like even a better association than what I'm hearing with the 0.45, which isn't bad.
So I had if I understand the second question correctly, about tying item types to item specifications for range of achievement levels descriptors. If I understand that, it's whether you want to actually identify whether the item should be multiple choice or some other kind of item, depending on what the evidence statement is implying. Is that what you're saying there? And that's not a bad idea. And it might, there should be something implied in the evidence statement that would drive the item type, and some thought into looking at those evidence statements or whatever the specifications are to see if there's something that's really suggesting. Because often what happens is, we have these different item types, let's just use them sort of randomly, make sure we have them on the test, rather than really having the standard or the evidence statement drive the best way to measure students' mastery of this, ability to provide you the evidence you need. So, some evidence statements really might suggest a more constructed response kind of a question than a multiple select or multiple choice kind of question. And so I think you really need to take your clue from the standard or the evidence statement itself, attempting to, see if you can move in that direction. I think it would help item writers certainly, and help you get perhaps more of those items that are measuring at the higher levels on your assessment.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Mhm.
Is there any other overall feedback for connecting the systems?
Christy, this is Chad. I think to that third question, connecting the systems, is it really that you're talking about different constructs present? Or are you talking more about kind of features that influence? So again, when you talk about different constructs, I do start to worry about a dimensionality concern. And so if we're worried about dimensionality, that's probably a different question that we're not probably directly addressing. But if you're talking about how to best incorporate some of the different influencing features, I think what Jeff was just suggesting is one way to do that. It's just another feature or characteristic of the item specifications, recognizing that you are still striving for a computer adaptive test. I think part of the communication that would go out to the field on this is that there's not an expectation of uniform content distribution across the scale. And I think that is something that I think the average person doesn't understand, because everybody's pretty familiar with a fixed form test where you have a certain percentage of content represented, and the way that the content actually scales within an item pool like this is you're not going to have all the geometry questions kind of uniformly distributed from easy to moderate to more difficult. They're going to potentially cluster in certain parts of the scale more so than others, and all the content will do that. So I think that might be a piece of it. And if you try to over rely on kind of a traditional item specification or content specification, you'll lose some of the efficiency of the CAT, which I know you know, but that's something I think it would be important to communicate to the field as to how the assessment may actually feel more uneven, even though the underlying empirical properties are going to be equal for students.
So what you're saying resonates with me very much. What do you think peer reviewers are open to that notion, or do you think that there needs to be more type of research like this, and then showing that you're getting comparable blueprints in some way, or you're focusing on the learning progressions? Because what I want to make sure is that we're successful in meeting those, the state criteria from that perspective as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because I've been like trying to put on the peer reviewer hat of saying, okay, if the peer reviewers are trained to effectively use Webb's methodology for evaluating alignment, how are they going to look at this? Well, if we think about the evolution of how peer review has looked at adaptive testing for kind of federal requirements, Idaho was, I think, like that first attempt that the feds basically said, no, you can't do that. And so you've got to have basically essentially kind of a fixed form-ish, but you can deliver on the computer. Well, now with Smarter Balanced, that's an adaptive test, but it's an adaptive test that has certain content constraints associated with it. So we have seen the feds, at least from an evolutionary perspective, move from, just the Jesse Helms perspective of no to everything to smarter balanced, saying, okay, well, here's this kind of interim approach where we can be efficient, but there may be some content constraints. So I think that next evolution would either say to relax the content constraints or to take something without content constraints and add like a dimensionality study or something to it as well to illustrate the unidimensionality across the scale. And I think, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily know what the peer reviewers, I don't know how rigid their training is right now. And one of my colleagues internally actually is doing peer review. So I can probably ask him to find out kind of how they're training people on it. But that would be my sense. I mean, I would probably, right. I mean, I'm from Nebraska. We try to, I think, do everything a little differently. So I would probably just try to push it and say, hey, listen, the model is robust enough to support this efficient measurement approach because everything's placed on the same scale. We can demonstrate the alignment of the item bank to the standards, and then the personalized experience that each student is then getting to kind of maximize measurement efficiency to the ability of the student. I mean, the worst that they could say is put in a content constraint, which I know your IT people probably wouldn't like that, but I would at least force them to reject it. And then you can kind of raise a stink because the concept has been around for quite a while. And I think you're getting more support now, I think, broadly, even at the peer review level, than you probably would otherwise.
Yeah, one of the great things about what we've done so far is we can dig in very deeply at the grade level before we have to worry about going off grade level. So we can give really a pretty significant opportunity for students to dig in at varying levels, not as much at the upper end, obviously, as you saw with those third grade results, but on the lower side, we can dig in very deeply at grade level material before we have to go off grade level to meet students where they are. And so at least the way that I'm looking at it right now is we should be able to give better on grade information back to the field than that they're currently getting with just map growth. It's going to be strengthened by merging those two banks.
Yeah, I think part of the thing that peer reviewers get caught up in is the actual content constraint or the content representation of the blueprint. And that I think, Christy, is what you're sensitive to as well, that if they're not willing to look at something that is less than whatever the number is now, 5 or 6 minimum items per content constraint or something, that it potentially creates a challenge even within grade for that representation. And that's where I do think I'm thinking about some stuff, Christy, that Joe Ryan used to show all the time, right? With kind of the way content is clustered in different parts of the scale, these really cool graphics that illustrate, hey, the content's all there. Wherever the student is, this is where we're kind of maximizing that representation. So I don't know. I guess I think there are ways to do it, and I would probably press the issue. Again, new administration in DC is supposed to be supporting science, right? So we would presumably get a little more support.
Yeah, and we don't mind pushing them a little bit. That's not a place that we've ever, not been before anyway.
Well, thank you. This has been really helpful, and I appreciate the immense amount of time that you allowed us to kind of build this framework and talk through it, because that evidence argument, I think, is going to be critical getting through the peer review processes. But I also think it's really important to make sure that it's there so that we're guiding instruction. Next, I'm going to turn this over to Melinda, who is going to share the what we're calling the prioritization model for implementing this.
Chad, I don't know if we want to take a break before we do this, just to give everybody a chance to stretch before
Yeah,
we get into this.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you built that into the agenda.
I did, just because I know if was sitting in front of the computer for too long, it's really difficult to maintain your concentration. So if we just take a short break for everybody to, I mean,
Yeah.
so in some cases, grab a sandwich or whatever the case may be, if they need to eat because we're taking up your lunchtime and those types of things. So I don't know. It's 12:36 at Central Time right now. So I don't know if we want to take like 10 minutes and come back at 12:45.
Yeah, that's fine for me. That gives me a chance to get another Coke too.
Yeah, I'm out of Pepsi myself. So, okay.
All right.
Let's
take
plan
10
on doing
minutes.
that, and Melinda will be a great presenter for us after we come back from break.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Jeremy, as soon as folks come back, we'll go ahead and turn the session over to Melinda to lead us in the next discussion.
Sounds great. TAC members, if you'll either put in chat if you're back or come on to video, that will help us know if everybody's back or not. If you want to stay off of video because you're eating or whatever, that's perfectly allowable and fine, but
So you're saying, Jeremy, that you won't judge us if we are eating goldfish?
I won't. I got some cashews for myself and the dog. I know he's not supposed to have very many, just a couple a day. So if you're
Thanks. Linda, I think we're mostly back. Bob will be back in a moment. So please feel free to go ahead and kick off.
All right, can we see my screen?
we can, yep.
And the actual one, not the slide, not the notes and that.
It's the right one, yep.
It's the correct one. It's always good. It's always good to check that. So.
Yep, it is. You're good.
All right. So this is going to be an introduction to the prioritization model, and I believe that Jeremy has some things he wants to say about the introduction slide. Is that correct?
Not very much that I haven't probably already said today. You know, this is one of the models that we've been looking at. NWA's run several different versions of through-year model as we've been going forward, and this is where we kind of are right now in this prioritization model. The only problem with it is it's tough to say. No, just kidding. But Melinda's going to introduce it and talk about it. And next time we get together, we will probably talk about some of the simulation results that we have from it. So kind of a high level, this is what the prioritization model is, and then we'll go on from that.
So this introduction that we're going to do is based on some initial decisions that NWA has made around the model configurations, just to get our proof of concept up and running. And there are many more decisions that are left outstanding that will be made in coordination with NDE around these configurations, like what the scores are that'll be provided, and our achievement level or proficiency scores provided, and when are they provided, and what types of information is provided. So there's a number of things that will show you some of those decision points as we walk through this today. But this is all of what I'm going to show you is based on just some initial configurations that we placed on the model. And Mary's actually going to talk through the content decisions that we made just in order to kind of set this up and get it started. So as Jeremy said, we have been looking at several different versions of a through-year model, going back for several years, starting with like what was called, I believe, a cumulative blueprint model. We have a dynamic multi-phase model that we're continuing to work with. And then what I'm going to present today is the prioritization model. So where we are in this process, at this point, we have completed some initial model definitions and engine updates to the branch of the engine, not the engine that's live giving a test right now. To the branch of the engine, we've made some updates. We have done a proof of concept in what we call the sandbox. So again, it's not part of the operational delivery that's going on right now. We did our proof of concept in the sandbox, and then we made some preliminary decisions around that initial proof of concept and made some updates to what we're running right now. So initially we noticed, for example, that it wasn't going to adjacent grades. And that was in discussions with Jeremy. We wanted it, if it was going to go off grade, we wanted it to go to an adjacent grade. So that's one of many just kind of things that we set in order to go on to our simulations we're running right now. And so right now simulations are running. We are going to evaluate those simulations at like the normal way we would evaluate simulations, looking at reliability and blueprint matching and bias. But we're also looking at individual students and how they progress through the test and what kind of information does a student see or could a student see based on this model. And as Jeremy said, we hope to be able to present that to the TAC over the next month as we get those results in. And then we will be collaborating with NDE on what that content updates, further content updates need to be, what those reporting decisions are based on those results and what we're seeing for at the aggregate level and also for individual students taking the test. So we have some guiding questions as we walk through this that I'd like you to be thinking about. We've already talked a little bit about peer review, but then of course, peer review is also one of our questions around this model, and the question of whether this design will satisfy their requirements for, particularly if a student goes off grade or stays on grade. What will the feedback be? And then we're also wondering about the extent that the model design would support the proficiency and growth of interpretations and uses that we would like to be able to provide to students in Nebraska. We have a question around the scoring recommendations. I'll show you a couple of options of things that we've been thinking about what kinds of scores we could get, but we'd like to get your input on that. And then lastly, so any high priority research questions we should be addressing right away. And we know there are a number of things we want to research, particularly when we do a pilot of this with students. There's a number of questions we have, but there may be something really high priority you think that we should focus on right away before this goes live with students, and we would love to hear about that. So there's our guiding questions. So what is the prioritization model? It's an excellent question, right? So what it does is it allows measurement goals to be defined at runtime, so while the student starts to take the test, based on prior knowledge about the student and also knowledge gained within the test. So we can use information from previous tests about proficiency and where they were, and we can then use information during the test to kind of adjust the individual experience for that particular student. The reason we think this is valuable is it maximizes our efficiency. We can stop asking questions we already know. So if a student already is proficient in number sense, I don't need to ask them 8 more questions 3 times a year about number sense, right? If they already know that information. Possibly, that's something, again, that's configurable, but it does allow us to make decisions about what kinds of questions we are going to ask a student. And it also allows us to tailor this to each student and start asking questions based on what a student really needs to know for instruction. So maybe we can identify weaknesses in the student's ability, and then we can focus in on that and give targeted feedback to teachers and students that they can use to improve their day-to-day instruction. So, and the way we're thinking about this is that we can really start thinking of testing in this prioritization model as part of learning, so that it is not just individual results to guide learning, but it's individual learning to help guide the results that we see. So it's very tailored to a student. It adjusts on the fly. It's going to allow educators and parents to have the results that will help them understand where the student needs support and where they're ready to be more challenged in the content area. So I keep saying personalized assessment. And so here's an example of what that might look like. And again, this is all very configurable, but in a personalized assessment, once we know an achievement level, we kind of know where the student is on the continuum of ability based on the blueprint, then we can adjust that blueprint on the fly, and a proficient student might be able to move off grade so they can have content that's more challenging and they can show what they can do. A developing student could shift to more diagnostic information and develop the weak points and opportunities to address deficits in learning. The blueprint can also do a combination of those 2 approaches. And so we can't assume that just because a student is on target, that they're on target in all areas. Maybe there are certain aspects of the construct that we could drill down on a little bit and give feedback and support, in addition to giving them challenging items.
Melinda?
Yeah.
So when we're talking here, are we talking about an assessment that's taking place during the year or the summative assessment?
We're talking about three times a year, fall, winter, and spring.
Right.
So, yes.
Okay. So when you say adjust the blueprint, I'm trying to understand what that means exactly. Because are you saying that maybe we won't, measure the full range of the blueprint? We'll eliminate some category of the blueprint, narrow it in some way? I'm just trying to understand this idea of adjusting the blueprint.
And I have some more slides on this coming up, but I can kind of explain a little bit. So basically, we're talking about the first 25 items or so, is how we've done our model at this point, are proportional to our current summative blueprint. Just like we're doing the 23 item test this spring, which is proportional to the Nebraska blueprint. This would be 25 items or so at the beginning of the test, proportional to the blueprint. After those 25 items, we can tell where a student is, and then we can focus the second part of the test on this more diagnostic information. So it's not really two phases, but it's really two parts of a test. The blueprint covers the entire 35 items in this particular case I'm thinking of, but those last 10 are targeted towards particularly giving a student challenging items or identifying areas where a student
is it likened to like a staged adaptive approach?
It's not really staged in this case. It just it actually just shifts the blueprint covers, since the blueprint covers all 35 items, it just kind of narrows it after that first 25 or so.
Does it narrow it in the sense that it, like you said before, if the blueprint covered number sense, and from the first 25 questions, it appears the student has mastered the number sense standards at that grade level, then the second group of questions that you provide will not cover numbers.
Exactly. It would focus on more other constructs that they need support in, or maybe they're strong in all sorts of items and we want to give them some more challenging CCR level cognitive complex items in math.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Are the first,
How will this be different from the MAP test that teachers are so familiar with right now?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch part of that.
How will it be different from the MAP growth test that schools and districts are using now?
Well, this is on the NSCAS item pool. So this is aligned to your NSCAS summative blueprint. So which MAP growth is not. MAP growth is a broad range of items across all score points. This is going to be targeted towards your NSCAS item pool, your NSCAS blueprint, what they're being taught in the classroom, but it does allow this flexibility to go and provide more challenging items, somewhat like what MAP does.
Okay.
so the first 25, I was confused as I read, is it adaptive or?
Yes, yes, fully adaptive, yes.
So my first 25 as a weaker student may be different than someone else's.
Yes.
If you have no history on the student, they may, it'll still be 25. It'll just, I'm assuming the error goes up a little bit if you don't have that previous information or that first year.
Or where the student even starts, Cindy, right? So if you have previous information and you know they have been struggling, you can start them at the lower end of that scale at the grade level, right? Or based on where they previously performed.
Right, you can use that information from previous assessments, but in a CAT, generally in about 10 to 15 items, the CAT can figure out pretty well where a student is. So if we don't have previous information, they're a third grade student, for example, the CAT is going to figure that out pretty quickly. And we have seen that the engine does a very good job of figuring out where a student is by the questions it gives and adapts very quickly.
So just to make sure I put a pin on this, the first 25 questions are, it's not a fixed form, it's an adaptive
Correct.
piece of the test.
Yes, correct.
And it can start without any information, or if there's previous information, it can start students differently, but it's going to cover the full range of the blueprint, those 25 questions. You're not going to narrow the blueprint at that point.
At the moment, the way we have set it up, it would cover proportional to the blueprint. And we actually have a table.
It means, when you say that, there's like 15% of the blueprint is number sense and 20% is geometry and another 15% is algebra.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to be sure what.
Yeah, we do have a table. When we get to the content section, Mary will walk through a table
ahead here. Yeah.
of how we set it up so far, and you can kind of see exactly what we mean. And we compared it back to the 2019 full like 41 item blueprint, so you can kind of see what the choices we made.
Okay.
And it's adaptive based on a Roche, is that right?
Yes, it's Roche. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a high level model path diagram of what this kind of looks like. And again, this is based on the decisions we made for our proof of concept and how we're set it up right now. This is all configurable. So I don't want anyone to think like this is the way it has to be. It's not necessarily. This is how we are currently running, and we hope to get feedback from all of you about how we can make this better and make these decision points with consultation with NDE. So here's the model diagram. So I'm going to start up here at this blue box where it says first set of items. So as we were just saying, this first set of items could be informed by prior proficiency from winter into spring, from fall into winter, or it doesn't have to be. This is a decision point that NDE can make, how to start. If a student's already on track or CCR, what happens during that first set of items? Do they all get, as you see in my green box, on grade items, about 25 that match the blueprint, or are there some other decisions that are made for this first set of 25 items? So there are a number of decision points that can be made. Currently, we're doing 25 on grade proportional to the blueprint items at the beginning. And then we are evaluating using probability whether a student is, based on those first 25 items, whether they are CCR, on track, or developing. Now, again, this is not how it has to be set up. This is an NDE decision about how to route students. This is just currently how we set it up so that we could break students up in these different groups, the developing section, the on track, and the CCR, and decide about next steps in our particular model.
One thing I'll mention about that too is when Melinda says it's an NDE decision, it's really a policy decision, and we are also bringing in advisory groups to help us with those decisions. It's not just NDE making a decision without informing and getting feedback from others.
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Yep.
There would be two things I think to consider. Well, probably more than two things, but one is we certainly see some summer regression, and we do not see uniform summer regression. It varies by poverty level. And so I would want some additional evidence to say they had number sense last spring, they've still got it. Because that has not always proven in the real world to be true. The other thing I hear a lot is the concern about the naming of the proficiency levels. Career and college ready is really, it's a difficult thing for parents to interpret. So you can score and get a report that says your career and college ready on an alternate assessment where you're a student in a life skills program and you are anything but career and college ready. On the other hand, we have students who are scoring in the top quintile on MAP who get reports that say they are not college and career ready. Second graders are confused by that, or parents are. It's like, are they college and career ready now? Wouldn't they only be on track in second grade? So the naming, I think, is problematic. And I don't know, Jeremy, are you hearing other people say it would be great to rename them?
Yeah, we have heard that, and that's you know, and this is a good example of where it didn't happen. I try to point out that it's college and career ready benchmark as opposed to just CCR, right? And that the definitions do matter, but I think there is some problematic in the naming of it. It wasn't obviously that wasn't our intention to tell anyone that a student wasn't on track to be or wasn't college and career ready, because on track to us means proficient and on track to being college and career ready. And we certainly don't want anybody to think that a third grader is college and career ready unless they are actually Doogie Howser or something like that. So, you know, there are some, yeah, that dates me a little bit, I know. There are some problematics with naming, and we've considered how do we fix that and how do we move forward with this as well. But it's a good point to continue to bring up for us as we're dealing with that. The other thing that I'll say is one area that I've expressed concern about repeatedly is what information do we give to teachers, right? So if we give them information about their proficiency, a student's proficiency in the fall, does that have unintended consequences? And so that's one area where we want to be really clear with our stakeholders and getting feedback on is what information do we present to teachers? Do we label kids before the end of the year? And how is that information presented so it doesn't have unintended consequences? We know one of the big things we want to keep emphasizing is that these are interim assessments and they're supposed to help give information back and keep growing students, their learning and their achievement. And so we want to be really careful about any summative information that we give back to districts, to teachers, to schools, because we don't want unhealthy decisions being made as we move forward. So what that looks like and how that's reported back is still a very up in the air piece of information right now for us to continue to be informed by that. And with our stakeholders, we have 2 different groups that we're planning on bringing that information to and getting additional feedback from the field in that area.
Yeah, and so the naming in here is just all our internal, the way we set this particular proof of concept up. None of this is set in stone at all. This is just how we're thinking about dividing it up in some way.
Are you thinking that this will give schools, teachers, districts the same information that we get from MAP growth, for instance, growth projections and things? Because if not, I know some districts probably are going to feel like they have to use MAP growth too to get that information, and that would double their testing time.
Yeah. So,
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, sorry. So we're still working on all the details, but all that information can come out of this. And that is the intent, is for it to serve that purpose so that we aren't double testing, right? So during the transition, there may be districts that feel like they need to do both, and we get that and understand it. But ultimately, there shouldn't be a need for doing both of them, because in many cases, it's going to be redundant for 3rd through 8 in ELA and for math.
How long do you think that transition period would last? I know it's hard to estimate, but.
So next year, and I'll come back in May, I'll come back and give a transition update about what our plans are for next year. And I already realized earlier in the session that we should have probably did a little bit of that at the beginning. So next year is a partial implementation, and then 22-23 would be full implementation. And I'll give more details on that the next time we meet.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I think confidence level of districts, if the RIT score is significantly different on the new NSCAS than what they're seeing in their map as they're giving both, it will prolong that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things, for this year with the districts for this test this spring, districts will get an estimated RIT score or RIT score and based on the linking. And so how different those scores are going to matter, right? We know they won't be identical. If you test on 2 different days or even in the morning and the afternoon, you shouldn't get the same score most likely. But how different they are matters. And so there'll be opportunities for this spring and then next winter as well for districts to compare the 2 and to look at that information. And then that would be what I would assume districts will start making decisions based on that information. So how well of a job we do really matters in those 2 time periods specifically. Okay, go ahead, Melinda. I think going ahead and doing this, and then I know we'll have more questions and more feedback.
Okay. So once we've, in our current model setup, once we've classified where a student is in terms of their overall proficiency as they move through the test, then we can route the students to specific things. So I have students who are on track, maybe they get more challenging CCR items, that level, higher level items that are cognitively complex. Or maybe they're developing student and they get more diagnostic items that drill down to particular areas of weakness or where that we've discovered that they were struggling in the first 25 items. So it allows the test then this is where it focuses the blueprint, refocuses the blueprint. The first 25 items happen over here in the middle. This is the refocusing and narrowing and just giving these 10 items that are focused on the individual student needs. based on how the student is doing here, we do have a place where it can come back. So suppose we started giving a student who was on track, or they were proficient, we started to give them challenging items and they were finding they were really hard. It can come back to on grade content at the end if it needs to make sure that it's giving students items that are helpful to them and are beneficial.
So is the purpose of going in these different directions here more challenging or maybe less challenging, really to increase precision and not really, precision of even a lower score or a higher score on the scale? I mean, are you really going to be giving diagnostic information back to schools based on students who are, having trouble on the test and aren't receiving the challenging questions? Again, it just might be your internal way of talking about these things, but it seems to me that the purpose here is really to, well, you want to provide information, but doing this seems to me as a mechanism for increasing precision of the measurement.
So we weren't thinking about it in terms of precision, more we were thinking about actual direct feedback about these particular items, like the areas of the construct that we identify. So it's very individualized. So the student is in a low ability student. We discovered that item, they're a 5th grade student. I don't know, Mary may have to help me, like 5.1.2a or something. They were really weak in that. And so we started giving them some more 4th grade items maybe, or other items in that area to see if there was really a particular ALD that we could identify that this student was struggling with. And that's the kind of feedback we're thinking about from the middle section of the test right here, is it's feedback that's targeted to those ALD levels, those individual items that the student saw, how difficult or easy those items were, and how the student performed on those items. So this is very different. This is not necessarily a score. It could be a score, but it also could be different kinds of feedback for the class.
Maybe it's helping answer the question what the student can do.
Yes, what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, if they're not doing well, but maybe on these grade level standards, they're not able to answer the items correctly, but on these standards from a lower grade level, they are. So it answers the question, well, can they do it if they're in the 4th grade and can't do the 4th grade work, can they do 3rd grade work?
Can they do, yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I'm just trying to, put this in more concrete terms of what you'll be able to say from this.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and like we talked about before a little bit, the depth of the pool at grade level is much more robust than it is just with the map growth items, for instance. And so you can go deeper at grade level material too. 2 things that I'd say about the question that you had is it also helps us determine growth from year to year and within the year with those additional items, figuring out where students are, and they're therefore giving good growth information back to districts. But the other thing I'd say is this is where the earlier topic under with the range ALDs and all of that information really comes into play. Can we give good information about learning progressions back to districts as they do this, right? So right now with map growth, districts have access to the learning continuum information. The range ALDs kind of serve the same purpose to be able to provide good information back to districts and teachers, and the precision of that information back is really important. So it's taking and focusing on those instructional pieces and that data that we can provide back in that area. And that's where there's a lot of overlap in today's topics.
I think one way to help understand this better is actually kind of think about if you could present what the score report will look like.
Yes.
Because then we could understand what you're doing here. Because without actually saying this is what we're going to report, it's hard to understand these. I think it'll create in terms of trying to communicate more about this. I think if you start from the report, then you can work back and show how you're going to get to report the results that you want to report.
And I completely agree with that. And that had been our plan for this meeting. And we have gotten we're running simulations right now. We just weren't able to get this all wrapped up. We've had illness and we've had some things happen, and that kind of put us behind. But I 100% agree that looking at what that report looks like and what that feedback will be very helpful.
Yes.
And then the other thing I'll say about that is the types of information that districts currently get back from map growth was where we started, in that is to make sure that it was similar to that information, because we know districts rely on that information a great deal. And so trying to make sure as we did this hybrid that they were still going to get that same type of information.
Can I ask, related to the diagnostic items, how are they selected? And are they also going to be adaptive? Like, is
They're
it based on a Roche model still?
Yes, so they are still adaptive, and they are selected based on, and Mary's going to talk a little bit more about this, but they're selected based on where the student's level of proficiency was. We decide whether we're going to give them, again, challenging items or diagnostic items, and then they're chosen by those item difficulty levels. It is a CAT, fully adaptive CAT, so it's going to choose those items as it narrows the blueprint around their areas of strength or weakness. It's going to choose those items adaptively.
Okay,
sorry.
and the challenging items, they're also adaptive. And so what I'm trying to get is, how are the challenging items and the diagnostic items different from any other item, versus just having higher or lower difficulties?
Yeah, there's certain focus around content. In fact, I think we're coming up to that next. So why don't we move into that section so you can kind of see some of the content decisions we've made that might help answer some of these questions.
The easy answer is the constraints change, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the constraints around the blueprint and other things changed about what's required to be tested in those first 25 versus the others. But I'll let Mary get into a little bit more of that.
Before you leave, I have one more quick question.
Sorry.
It looks like if you initially, after the first 25, are designated as developing, the additional items don't feed that. You stay developing. But if you were PCR or on track, your final designation could vary.
And that's not exactly true, because developing is a pretty large range. So if they're just below on track, or they're a higher level developing student, you see this little dotted line here, they could go back up and they could get some on track items, because it's possible that they're developing it, but it's really only a couple of reporting categories they're struggling with. Maybe they're stronger in the others. So we could actually give them some on track, more challenging items for those students. Again, as that slide before, it can do both. It can do both things in that 10 item section.
So they are not just then diagnostic. They are also feeding, all of the 35 items are feeding the final designation for a student.
They can. That's a scoring decision that we would have to make. That has not been made yet. And when we get to the scoring section, we'll talk about those options.
And like I said, whether we give that information, right? So I think there's big decisions have to be made in the interim reporting space, right? And whether we give those designations or if we only do that in the summative space, right? So as I think about the testing, we have interim fall, interim winter, interim spring, and then we have summative determinations. And when do we give those summative determinations, and what information we give back is a big piece that we have to be very careful about. Because if we're giving those summative determinations in the fall, then it feels like summative testing as opposed to interim testing. And so I think we want to be very careful about, prescribing too early what students are, as opposed to just giving information back.
Yeah, I'll get parents who want to be grade skipped in September. Basically.
Yeah, and I want to be really careful about encouraging anybody to do such things, right? Because that's not the intent. And so as we get into some of those reporting categories, that's why I keep coming back to this particular visual gives me a little bit of heartburn every time, because I don't want people to think, oh, well, we're going to know all of that all the time. It could do that. It could give that information back. And we can bank that information, and there's a lot of decisions to make on all of those things. This is just a simulation right now for what we're looking at. And I want to keep pushing that as well, because I know we want to be very careful about unintended consequences, and we want to be very careful about how people feel about each of those interim assessments.
Yeah, this is just really how we set up our proof of concept to get a simulation ran, so we can get the kind of feedback to make those decisions. So this is certainly not the final version.
And all of these things, even those levels could change, and what we call those things could change technically as well. We could name them completely away from those designations that we use for summative purposes completely if we wanted to, for instance.
Mhm. Okay, we've already talked about this, so I'm going to skip over to the information about the blueprint, and I'll let Mary take over.
Sure, thanks, Melinda. And I'll apologize in advance. They're doing construction work outside. So if you hear a bunch of noise, that's what that is. So this is a sample blueprint based on the same percentages we have been using. So we just wanted to show you that we are honoring the percentages of the current blueprint that's available. One other thing we want to note is that we're aware of standards being updated, both for ELA and then following for math. So we know that also means revisiting the blueprint and any updates there. So that would get adjusted as well. And for this work, we started with grade 5 for simulation. So what you'll see as we move through this, these are examples of what we can do. And this was to get us started with the simulations. We know that all of these decisions will have to be done in collaboration with NDE and policy decisions and simulation results. So I just wanted to preface that as we move through and look at the model. So are there any questions about the blueprint?
So you're, just to make sure I understand this is showing how you're going to pare down to the 25 items.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And comparing it to the 23 item that's going on right now. That's the test that's being administered right now in Nebraska.
Okay.
And as a related question, so this is how the content would be represented. Do you have a sense, going back to what we talked about earlier with kind of the distribution of difficulty on the scale? So will the 25 items then also kind of span the difficulty on the scale, or will it
Yes.
items be selected relative to?
It'd be based on what the student's ability, right? So adapted based
fully
on
adapted.
what items that they show that they're ready for. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, in mathematics, let's take that as the example. Recognizing that those content areas are not going to scale to kind of the same part, it'll be more difficult to find number sense items, for example, in the kind of moderate to more difficult. So again, it's just an observation of kind of the current state of the pool.
Right. Yeah. So you might get even though every indication is that you're a high ability student, but you need to get a number sense item, it might not be as tough, as difficult of an item as you would expect, because there just isn't a difficult enough item to represent where you currently are. Is an example that's what you're talking about, right, Chad?
Yeah, and so going back to the what Melinda was talking about in terms of kind of the blueprint is another way. So again, we think about blueprints oftentimes as kind of this proportional representation based on fixed form models of tests where we're looking for kind of a certain percentage of content representation. Is it potentially more appropriate for an adaptive assessment to say, I'll use math as the example. We have 4 subdomains that we're interested in measuring, and we'll have a minimum, let's say, of a certain percentage of, let's say, 25% or something. So we start with an assumption that, okay, we may have uniform distribution, but depending on where the student goes, they may have more of some content than others. So you're still, again, the goal is to measure each of the subdomains, but if we know that the subdomains are not uniformly distributed from a difficulty standpoint, is it as meaningful? And all we're doing is trying to fit a traditional blueprint mindset, and then we end up losing some precision.
It's a great question. It's a great point too.
We'd have to answer that today, but Melinda, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I assume that was more rhetorical. I'm sorry if you want more of an answer.
Well, somewhat. I guess what I'm just maybe extend the thought a little bit. Some of the work that I do in my say like licensure and certification, they will have at the major domain level like ranges of percentages to say that, again, applying that concept to say math at grade 5, that number sense would be anywhere from say 15 to 25% algebra. And so without having kind of a specific number of items that you may be forced to fit, depending on where the candidate or the student's ability takes them, I may have an upper and lower bound of representation, but because the pool is unidimensional in its representation of the mathematics construct, I'm comfortable that I'm representing the math and providing kind of that personalization piece. So all that to say, I'm almost wondering if you could think about, as you're doing some of these simulations, playing around with relaxed constraints, just to see relaxed constraints in the number of items, or giving yourself ranges to allow for greater precision and getting more to that personalization piece that I think is one of the major goals.
Yeah. It's some of this we've done already with one of the, so we used to constrain at the indicator level. So instead of the strands here that you see, the 3 strands in ELA and the 4 strands in math, we had a range for each one of those indicators. Well, we've put that up to the strand level to allow for more flexibility. But you're right in that right now it still is a hard number as opposed to a range within those. And maybe that's another way that we could loosen up some of those constraints, is to provide a range as opposed to a specific number within each of those strand levels. But we were trying to balance that with that peer review piece of it as well. But what you're saying about the difficulty level is well noted. Typically, if you are in the highest level of achievement, you typically don't have a problem with number sense items as a good example, right? So do you really need that much evidence, because the evidence you have already indicates that those students have that information or have those skills?
The other thing that we were trying to get is reliability, if we could, at the reporting category level, like number, algebra, geometry. And so if we have, I'm wondering, Chad, if we have a range, what will that do to our reliability at the subscore level?
Oh, well, I suppose it depends on what you're doing with it. I mean, if you think about it this way, if I'm a higher ability student, the reliability at the number sense level is already going to be pretty poor, because there's going to be no variability in the score. And so what I'm really looking for, I think, what I guess I'm projecting here, what I think you might be looking for is more of like a decision consistency at the reporting category level. And so looking at a conditional standard error of measurement to be modest, so that you're confident of like a mastery or non-mastery type of decision there within the reporting category. So that might be another way to look at reliability for then how you're trying to support use.
That is something we are going to be looking at with this current simulation, is the classification consistency with these reporting categories. But
yeah.
You know,
yeah, thank you. So this is where we get into the diagnostic piece. So we're looking at how we can meet students where they are, maybe the information that we can give back to educators that Melinda's already talked to quite a bit, but also the blueprint, adjusting it, looking into how we can support students once we move to the diagnostic phase. So I think we've talked about this slide a little bit already, but I wanted to pause and give you a chance to ask questions on this too before we look at the specific content decisions.
I think it may be a question or comment that we can kind of hold to the end. But Jeremy, one of the things that you had mentioned earlier about kind of a classification decision, proficient and above, I think where the peer reviewers start to get heartburn is when you start to talk about when something goes on or off grade. And so to make a determination of if a student is on track, a student is college and career ready, or whatever that benchmark is, if you have evidence to support that at a particular point in time, and thinking about how end of course assessments, a student who is an 8th grader may meet an end of course requirement, but a student who's an 11th grader or a senior may also. So it's it's less grade dependent and more where the student's ability is. And I think the same thing applies here. So if you have, if you have a student who is proficient on grade 5 content in the fall, you likely will have that evidence to make that more summative decision and to simply then replicate that activity for she or he into the spring, then misses opportunities for some of the challenge items or the diagnostic piece that then helps to inform the instruction. I think, and again, this comes back to kind of like the policy and business rules of how you function with this.
Right.
I think once you've made that summative decision, you almost can bank that. And then from there, everything else becomes a more formative or interim type of purpose, even if it comes later in the year. It's a data management challenge.
Yeah.
But I think you have to allow yourself that flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. The questions around banking proficiency are one that we have to fully tackle. Technically, we might even not only from earlier in the year, but you could technically bank it over years as well as a possibility of things in the future. But also being able to come back and make sure that the students are still where we think they are, that verification type of thing. But also trying to capture those growth. And there's lots of decisions within those pieces. And to Cindy's point earlier is making sure that students could still, if they're not in the top level, could they still increase it based on ongoing types of things, ongoing information and evidence that comes back. And I think one of the things around peer review that I want to keep focus on is when do we have enough evidence? The same goes for even that blueprint at the beginning, right? So we could have, for a student that's struggling, for instance, if we have so much evidence, how long do we need to keep them at grade level when we know that they've repeatedly shown that they're where they are is below grade level, right? How much additional evidence do we have to continue to gather before we go off grade level? And I think that's the point overall is a really great one, because making those decisions with the amount of evidence that we have is really important, and will continue to be based around information that we get from stakeholders and input groups as we're making those decisions. But it's excellent point.
Yeah. And I think, Jeremy, I just a minor add-on to that, as you're talking with some of those stakeholder and advisory groups, I think to make any sort of decision summatively prior to, say, a winter administration is problematic, because you really kind of disconnect the assessment experience then from the claim that curriculum and instruction and assessment are connected. And that's kind of at the top end, right? You don't want to allow somebody to say, oh, well, they're proficient, and so obviously this year's instruction didn't mean much for that student.
Right.
Or vice versa, that you make the decision too soon to drop below grade, where you haven't allowed instruction opportunities to try to have an influence to allow that student to catch up or get to grade level.
Right. Yeah.
And then you run into some of the social justice issues, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were mentioned earlier.
And I think using one of the things that I keep thinking about too is the amount of evidence we have in making summative decisions, right? So when you have, it's not just one test event, but you have multiple test events over the course of the year, and how you make that determination matters a lot. And what evidence that the way you weight evidence and those types of pieces as well, as opposed from the beginning of the year to the end of the year and those types of things.
We'll talk about that a little bit more in our last topic of the day, I think,
absolutely.
too.
I have just kind of a general comment, because you've mentioned things like certain subdomains or certain areas. One thing you want to be conscientious of is you have a unidimensional model, and you're using an adaptive test that's based on that unidimensional model. And so those two approaches completely ignore blueprint in that regard, which means it may be very, very difficult for you to actually get distinct information about subdomains. So what you may get are just less reliable measures of that unidimensional model. And so you want to be really conscientious of it in the sense that even though you can think of them as having certain subdomains or certain areas that you're selecting items, the model sees those items as just an item difficulty. So it's entirely possible that whenever you narrow that blueprint, depending on how the CAT works, you may still only be getting about half those items right. And kind of what determines what items you get right or wrong is where their difficulty falls relative to theta, as opposed to the actual domain. So you want to kind of be conscientious that in some ways, the way those items are selected and how the distribution of those difficulties look could actually be the thing that determines how you report back, as opposed to where they're actually at.
That's a good point.
So to get into some of the more content specific decisions, and again, this was to get us going with the simulations, and we will take additional feedback on other things, like you said, what we might want to constrain on differently. But for now, what we decided was that we would prioritize on-grade content over off-grade content. So we felt that that was the best approach to take and maximize the on-grade bank as much as possible. And then if we do go off grade, it would be the adjacent grades that are prioritized. So making sure that we're keeping within a range that's reasonable for students before we even go further out. We also decided in terms of prioritization that we would first, if students have any area that is showing as a place, maybe they're developing in that one area, we would focus on where they need support first before moving to their strengths. So if we have to pick one or the other, we're going to pick where we can provide feedback to educators and students on things that they might want to work on to bring them towards proficiency for that area. And then when there's multiple areas, maybe they have 2 different areas that they need support in, that prioritization would be based on the weight of the blueprint. So for example, if it's between number and data in math, we would prioritize number first because that's the biggest chunk of the work of the grade. But those are sort of the general content decisions we made before we got into things that were unique to each content area. But I'm curious, I'll pause here and see if there's any questions about this.
I mean, my only thought is, you're doing all of this with 35 questions. And, the extent to it, the kind of feedback you can provide other than the general domain, the overall domain is pretty limited. Mm-hmm. And you just have to keep that in mind. And that's why I would be interested. So if you give feedback that the student, could use more instruction in a particular area, going below the subdomain, even going to the subdomain, maybe, how reliable is that feedback going to be with the number of questions you have? That's the only thing that's, I like the idea, but you're limited given it's a pretty short test.
And that's part of what we're going to look at with the simulation results is what can we provide to educators and students and what makes sense to provide to them given the other issues that have already been discussed as well.
Good, great.
So there were some specific things by content area that we wanted to look at. For example, things that are often 50-50 and within ELA around informational text versus literary. We know that generally students have more difficult with content tied to informational text. So the decision was made to prioritize informational text over literary in terms of determining where they might need support. And then for passages, in order to select a passage where we think students would have access to the content they need, we're using sort of the difficulty of the items within that set to kind of target those passages in the right place for students. And then for math, one of the differences between the current standards for ELA and math, ELA has pretty consistent progressions at the indicator level. But for math, they change a little bit as we move across grades. So for math, we focused on, I see an email. Instead of, Melinda, I don't know if you can.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, close the email. Thank you, sorry.
No, it's my fault. I was trying to move it out of the way because it was popping up. Sorry.
No worries. for math, what stays consistent in the standards of the expectation level. So there's the strand, expectation level, and then the indicator. So for math, we called them out at the expectation level. So for example, we talked about number a lot. So there's numeric relationships, and then there's the operations. So that's what we mean by expectation level. And that's what stays consistent across in terms of determining priority decisions. But we needed to call that out because there are places in math where things are introduced for the first time where there might not be indicators below grade for that area. And similarly, sometimes there are indicators within a certain grade. For example, grade 7 doesn't have any indicators at numeric relationships. So from grade 6 to grade 8 would be that progression. So we called that out where it made sense to for math specifically. But are there any questions about the content decisions that we made?
I don't think any questions. I think as long as Nebraska, from a policy and their content, people are comfortable with those kind of prioritizations or decision rules. I mean, to me, that's more of a content issue than a psychometric one.
And that's something that we'll collaborate with them on, especially as standards change.
All right, we'll talk about some of the scoring decisions that we still have to make and some of the configurations. This is where we had hoped to have some actual data to show you, but we don't. So we're just going to talk a little bit, a high level about some of the things that are still outstanding for us in terms of what kinds of scores we can provide. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is highly configurable. And I know I've said this multiple times before, and we can adjust this model for policy and administrative constraints. So we talked about leveraging bank proficiency, whether we do routing by achievement level, what those reported scores look like, what the testing window looks like. All those are decisions to be made. We also have already talked a little bit about the adaptive algorithm. The way we were thinking about that, the adaptive algorithm, was to ensure coverage of the number of items and points for comparable areas proportional to the blueprint. That's what we did for spring 23, but taking Chad's feedback to heart, we'll take a look at that in terms of what that actually means based on those ability levels, the item difficulty levels, and we'll take a look at that as well. But the goal of the 3-year score is to provide students with multiple opportunities to demonstrate progress towards proficiency over those 3 admins, so that they can show that they are actually accessing the blueprint and they are able to answer those areas that we have claimed are part of their accountability based on the blueprints. So for proficiency scores, if you want to call them that, or achievement level, whatever you want to call them, from the first half, we could give a score on those first 25 items. So those first 25 items, we could give an NSCAS scale score, a linked RIT score, which is, we're going to do a linked RIT using, right now we're using a lookup table for spring, but we'll be doing a linking study in the summer. So we hope to have those on the same scale and just be calculating the RIT score in addition to NSCAS. So we could give that for the first 25 items, and then give something different for the diagnostic section that's more ALD oriented and more specific about what the student got, what they saw and what they got right and wrong in terms of ALDs. We could also do an overall score based on the 25 and the diagnostic. However, what happens with that, and that we have to think about, is those 25 items are unique to that student. So that can actually raise or lower the score from what it was at the 25 when they saw the blueprint. It actually might change when they get to the 35, and maybe it doesn't change a lot, but that's something we have to take a look at and decide whether that's important, whether that's useful, how we would interpret that. So separate feedback might be from the diagnostic portion, might be what we want to do. That's what we want to decide, I guess, from our data. So at the moment, our plan is for on-grade proficiency NSCAS scale score with achievement level classification, at least in the spring, a linked RIT score. And then we have to decide, again, what to do with that growth section in terms of exactly what that looks like for feedback. The simulation results are really going to drive that, I think, when you're able to see what we're actually getting out of the model. And we're looking at both the whole grade level, but we'll also be able to look at individual students and track an individual students' progress through the test and see what they saw and how their scores changed what items they saw, and that should help us to make some decisions about that.
Seems like the proficiency score should be based on all the information you can gather. Why just base it on the 25 and not also include the additional questions?
What I've noticed so far in some of the early simulations is that score can go up or down depending. So a low ability student ends up seeing some very easy, maybe below grade items during the end, and they get all those right. And so now their scale score goes up from where it was at 25. Or a high ability student, there's also, they might go down actually because they get some harder items, but they couldn't answer the harder items. And so their score actually went down. So where you see the issue is at the tails of the distribution. So how we handle that, I always get concerned about the students at the tails, the students at the high and low end, and what happens with them. And so that's what we have to kind of sort out from the simulation. I agree with you. We have to use all of them, but what happens to those?
You know, how you use it is the question, I guess.
Is the question. How we put that in there without giving a wrong or an inaccurate, I shouldn't say wrong, but an inaccurate representation of where that student really is. I don't want to do that. That's not helpful.
It's on grade proficiency,
right?
When students are off graded at those
yeah.
tables.
Can I ask, when you're simulating, are you simulating a true theta, simulating responses, and then getting an answer? That's how you're getting.
Yeah.
So when theta goes up or it goes down, on average, does it tend to be closer when you use the 35 as opposed to 25? And I'm asking just because really the 35 items should give you estimates of theta that while they may be biased, they should be less and less biased the more items you give, and they should have smaller and smaller errors.
It actually varies depending on what the student saw, whether they went off grade or not in that diagnostic section. That's actually what happens. What I've seen so far in the early simulations, we're still tweaking the model, but to get the simulations out.
Okay, because
it doesn't always match up the way that you're describing it, which is I agree it should, but it doesn't quite yet.
Okay.
Melinda, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it doesn't, but I think the other is you're asking these really good questions. So for the diagnostic section, it's zeroing in on one or two domains.
Yes.
So it's oversampling one or two domains. So as we think about the scores from for proficiency, would oversampling one or two domains be comparable to sampling the domains per the blueprint? I think that's one of the questions that we have.
But in the simulation, do you actually simulate domain scores? I mean, like so it's one of those to where it may be honing into a domain, but if you simulate a single theta and then you simulate their responses from that theta, the domain it's a language thing, but in the simulated data, it doesn't exist.
It actually does when it changes from part 1 to part 2, in that it's looking at where the student is and then adjusting the blueprint into, as Christy just said, those maybe 1 or 2 domains that it's going to specify. So it does actually change the focus of the blueprint towards the end of the test.
Okay, and when you simulate the responses, I want to make sure I'm using the same language you are.
Okay.
When you simulate responses to the domains in the second section, is it still based on the theta and that item's difficulty?
Yeah, it's the theta and that item's difficulty, but the items are chosen based on some of those content decisions in addition to the item difficulty. So it's not just necessarily item difficulty alone in the diagnostic section, because we are focusing the blueprint now on specific areas for an individual student.
But is it a simulated response, or are you using actual responses from students?
It's a simulated response. Yes, it's a symbot. Yeah.
Okay, and so I think what I'm trying to figure out is you can say that items are narrowed down, but if the simulated response still only depends on theta and the item difficulty, then the simulated data doesn't know that it's narrowed down.
But it doesn't. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't just depend. In the second part of the test, it doesn't just depend on item difficulty. It also depends on the content area that was identified. So it has both of those things going on in the weighted, it's a weighted penalty model, a shadow based weighted penalty model. And so that's what it's doing. It has both of those aspects in it.
So the simulated response, so the probability of a correct response that's used to simulate it is now a function of the difference between the difficulty, the theta, and content.
Well, it's not the probability of it. It's not a simulated response in that it's the item is being selected, right? Based, that's what I'm saying. It's the items being selected based on a combination.
Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down in the weeds here, but
Yeah.
Where I was going with this is I think there's going to be this reality thing versus a model thing.
Okay.
And in your simulation, if domains really exist and you want to kind of see what happens, it might be worth including a little bit of model misfit. And model misfit would be the introduction of those actual domains in addition to a general ability. And then that would show you kind of, that's a simulation that's, it's actually introducing a little bit of misfit to the model, but it may be closer to reality. That would give you an indication of what you're doing is capitalizing on that.
Okay. So this was all that we had. Just have our guiding questions again that we probably kind of discussed some of these already as we've talked through this. One of the last question on here that we didn't ask earlier on is that we would be interested, NWA and NDE, in having some like working sessions with TAC members who might be interested to take a look at the simulation results as we're looking at them and to give us feedback. And we were wondering if there were any TAC members who might be interested in something like that over the next month, 6 weeks.
Yeah. So I would be interested because that feels like where we could get into the weeds.
Yes, that would be weeds for sure.
I would be interested as well. One of the things I think that will be difficult to explain to districts is if students' proficiency level changes based on out of grade level questions. I think there will be some people who say, really? How can my proficiency for my grade level drop when the questions you asked me were not at that grade level? I think that's, you're gonna have to make that argument.
Well, and I don't know that we will do that, Cindy, to be honest. I don't know that I would want to make that argument in general. So proficiency should be based on grade. So it's grade level proficiency should be based on grade level items. I mean, I think that's kind of a basic assumption, my basic assumption, but I also might need to learn more myself about that, right? But that doesn't mean that the growth scores and stuff can't reflect those off grade levels. But maybe that might be my assumption at this point in time.
That the RIT would be impacted, but the proficiency level would not.
Correct. Right. I assume peer review would have a big a problem with us using off grade level material to determine the proficiency.
They might with the growth too, to be honest, just because when you start, because that feeds into the accountability system. So when you start measuring growth,
True.
Depending on the density of the scale and everything, how strong that claim is.
Right. But they have to approve the accountability system. I guess they peer review the assessment. But they have to approve the accountability. That's true.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a quick question. Hey, Chad, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
On that last point, how do you interpret then when there's the allowance for the assessments to adapt above or below one grade, but still provide on grade level proficiency? How is that typically interpreted in terms of an adaptive assessment? Do they score only the designated on grade items to get the proficiency level then, even though they adapt off grade?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really the on grade. I'd want to, I guess to try to to try to learn more about how to build out the argument, I'd like to try to find out what some of the smarter balance states are doing with that, and then dig into their accountability systems a little bit to see whether or not they're using anything off grade to inform growth. Because I believe that the scores are based only on the grade level content, and then anything beyond that is considered for instructional purposes only.
I can speak to that, Chad.
I'm sorry?
I can speak to that. We did that research.
Oh,
So-
good.
So the smarter balanced assessments, they have to have about 62% of the content that's delivered on grade. And then they have a business rule calculation. And then if the child is in the top or the lower achievement level, they can then go off grade. And what we're seeing is exactly what you're saying in some of the accountability systems, that you have the summative determination for the proficiency, that is calculated, but then the total theta goes in for estimating your growth. I think you can see that in some of Delaware's technical documentation as well.
Okay. Melinda, what else? And by the way, you can put me into that little subgroup. I'm happy to sit down. I'd love to look at simulation results.
Okay.
That's pretty nerdy, I know, but
Well,
It'll be
and
fun.
everybody will be, just to clarify, everybody will get the results. It's maybe some of the working sessions and digging into some of them deeper, right? So.
Great. Melinda, anything else from your end? Any other, did we hit your questions? Is there anything as a gap that you're looking for more input here right now?
Let's bring this back up again. I think you answered some of our questions. We talked a little bit about peer review, and we also have talked a little bit about the growth and proficiency. We guys kind of need to look at that in the simulation and the scoring also from the simulation. The high priority research questions, I think one of the things I was noting was this idea of classification with reporting category that you were talking about, Chad. Was there something else that you think we ought to take a look at really quickly, anyone? No.
No, not hearing anything.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
Can I just trying to understand this? In terms of the scale range, the NCAS scale range, to score at the top of the scale, you have to be able to answer questions that are on the upper, in the subsequent grade level. You have to go off grade level to get the top score. So
Not currently. The current test does not go off grade level, right? So we're talking about the when we go to through year being able to go off level to continue to capture growth in the way that districts currently do with MAP growth. But currently the students only get on grade level items.
So it might have, so the off grade level questions might impact the RIT scale score, but not the NCAS scale score.
That's the way I'm currently thinking about it, correct? But that doesn't mean
It kind
that
of depends on how
the final decision, though.
Yeah.
It depends on how we decide to break that up and whether the RIT and NSCAS come from the first 25 or whether we look at all. It kind of depends on some of those ongoing decisions based on the simulation results, I think.
Yeah, I just want to caution that this is a, there are a lot of purposes we're trying to hit with any of these models, right? So making sure that we're trying to balance the kind of instructionally valuable information that teachers and students need throughout the year, which requires some deeper in the grade complexity of items, as well as maybe some off-grade items above and below to really personalize where is that student right now and to inform instruction. And then there's growth, which, MAP growth is a completely grade diagnostic. So it goes up and down the grades. And should try to understand if we can get enough information about a student's level of proficiency. Do we need to continue to evaluate their maintenance of that knowledge by the end of the year from a summative perspective or not? And I think there's this tension between being able to have assessments that don't take a long time, assessments that provide really valuable instructional information, and assessments that tell us if a student is, if we already know enough about a student's level of performance relative to the end of year expectations from the state, do we need to continue to ask them those kinds of questions or not? And these are policy questions, really. And it comes down to some of those business rules, right? Within any kind of adaptive environment. And then it's saying, well, you know, for any of those, is peer review that our ultimate arbiter of what is growth, what is achievement, what is proficiency, how do we provide instructional information, or not? And I think that that's where we could really, really use the TAC's guidance and helping NDE know from a policy perspective how they navigate this kind of innovation for their state, for information throughout the year to try to hit all of those competing priorities, and to do it well and do it defensively, right? And not mislead instruction, and so that students aren't left behind or don't receive the kind of engaging support or challenges that they need to grow as much as they can. Just want to state the obvious that it's very difficult to say we're going to have something that has sufficient number of items per web with an item level adaptive assessment and provide subscores and meets the wishes and desires from those folks who love math and not go off grade.
Well, and a related issue is around standard setting in a time of a pandemic. My belief is that, at least for us, and I think for other districts, those students who are non-participants this year are a non-random group. And so you'll be setting proficiency levels based on a less than full population, and the part of the population that's missing will be non-random, I think.
Right. And just for clarity, we're not setting standards for this year on this year's results by themselves, right? So we're not doing that. But a lot of the research is being informed by this year. It will have to be checked out as we move forward too.
Yeah, and Jeremy, to Cindy's point, I think just to reflect on what I'm seeing in other states is that on the standard setting question specifically, unless a state is kind of compelled to do standard setting for a new assessment or something this year, the TACs that I'm aware of in most states are saying don't do it because of Cindy's point of differential instructional and opportunity to learn issues, but also that kind of non-random section of the population where you may be over or underestimating performance, so that 2022 may be a better baseline year for something like that.
Yeah, and we don't have any standard setting planned for this year at all. Next year, so science, we're doing field test this year, and then we're going to operationalize science next year. But even those results in next year's standard setting process will have to be looked at very closely, because there's going to be potentially be differences between this year's field test and next year's operational test because of the pandemic impacts that we see. So we have to, anything that we get back this year, we have to make sure we're verifying as we move forward into future years.
And does MAP report growth using something like a student growth percentile? What is the metric? for MAP growth?
So MAP growth is using, it's the percentile ranks. And so they're modeling this growth is the likelihood that you're staying kind of in the same percentile rank across time. So, so you really want to, depending on where you are in that achievement distribution, work on increasing over the system projections, the growth of the child to, to have those rigorous and realistic growth curves, growth estimates. Cindy, do you have more to add in terms of how you think about it for the MAP growth?
Yeah, I do find that we have to be very, very careful in talking about growth percentiles. People barely often understand the difference between a percent and a percentile, let alone a growth percentile, where at the low end, sometimes students are seen to be doing well because they meet their growth goal, and that student is still not doing okay. And at the top end, we have people who panic because their growth percentile isn't very high, and they have difficulty interpreting it. That is, my kid's still doing fine.
Yeah, I just bring this up because we talk about, the scale and measuring growth and reporting growth, and just think it's important for, TAC members, at least I need to better understand, what the metric is, how it's interpreted, and, in terms of this new assessment system, what information is going to go into that metric. That's what I'm not clear about.
I can say though, when I set goals with my kids and I sit down and we talk about growth goals and stretch goals, especially for those kids that are below grade level, it's helpful for them to see, and like if they're at the 35th percentile, that to stay at that percentile, this is how many RIP points they want to go up. But my goal is to try to get them to close that gap. And so we want to do more than that. So that's one thing that I think MAP is helpful with, because it gives the graphs that the teachers and the kids can actually see. If I do this, this is where I'm going to be, and I'm going to start to close that gap to get up to where I need to be. So I think they're helpful.
So you can see how much, how much your RIT score should improve, but the question is, what do you need to do to improve it? I need to, improve it by 5 RIT score points, but
right.
what does that require in terms of my learning?
Right.
That's the real question.
And that's where we hope with the achievement level descriptors that you can see then where those cut scores are, because the other point of that is if you can be growing, but you're still kind of hanging out in the novice states of the content area for a long time, right? So the idea then is if you have the achievement level descriptors and we're kind of infusing those in the same way that teachers are using the learning continuum, they offer a little more nuanced information in some of the grades and content area that teachers can then say, okay, we have to grow you, and you have to get up to these content pieces as we grow you. And when you know these pieces of content and they're associated with these scores, then you have a score that you need to target, but you also have the content that you need to grow in that you can target.
And I agree, that's what's valuable for teachers, because for so long with assessment, we gave them a number and said, you better get kids to a higher place, but they didn't have much clue about how to do that. The other thing I will just tell you that my friends have talked a lot about that apparently is wildly popular, and I'm too far disengaged from it. Speaking of which, it's the disengagement tool. Apparently people are very, very concerned that they would like to see that tool stay with NSCAS. It has been, they think, a really strong component of MAP. So I don't know if that can be done or not.
I'm not sure we're ready to answer that right now or not, but I'm hearing the same thing, Cindy. Absolutely.
So Jeremy, I think in terms of our agenda, our next topic that I had asked to be put on there was just, it was more to kind of share with the full group some thoughts that Brian Gong had shared through an article or a blog post from the Center for Assessment. Brian was on Nebraska's TAC for a number of years, and I think always provides really measured thought leadership in a lot of these areas. And so I don't know that we can necessarily do it justice to have kind of a larger discussion today on this, Jeremy. But I think maybe for a future meeting, it would be useful as you start to flesh out some of the ideas around business rules and how decision-making, less about the scoring, I think, but the decision-making with the through assessment and how that plays out so that you can encourage and incentivize kind of appropriate behaviors and discourage inappropriate behaviors, and how the TAC can help partner with you to make that happen. So I think that was really kind of the purpose of that piece in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. Brian's thoughtfulness is always appreciated. This was kind of a follow-up, and you know what, I didn't put the blog post in there, but this was a follow-up to something he'd written earlier around through-year design and concerns that he had, and then he had received feedback from that blog post and then wrote this additional blog post. So I think there's even value in going back and looking at that original blog post. He expresses some concerns that are definitely important to think about as we move forward, and asked a lot of great questions and things that we are struggling with. I shouldn't say struggling to answer, right? In those types of things, because there's not a single answer necessarily for some of the questions that he has, but a lot of the policy decisions and business rules that you're talking about have a lot of weight and importance, especially when you're trying to incent the right behavior, right? And trying to make sure people don't do make sure there's not unintended consequences in the work that we're doing is important as well. And yeah, I don't know that there's specific discussion or questions generated by this, but it was mostly put out there to continue and inform the process as we move forward.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just thinking Brian's paper more made me think of semantics and what you call your model.
Yeah.
Whether you call it a through-year assessment, whether you call it a balanced assessment program, you're calling it now you're getting into using this word prioritization model.
Mm-hmm.
Where, some of the assessments you administer during the year kind of help locate the student for the final summative assessment. So it's I think it's a matter of semantics, and just in general, you might want to think about what you want to call it so it's not misinterpreted. Whatever you do.
Any others have any other big thoughts or general thoughts based on Brian's writing or anything we've talked about today, I guess?
Karen, go ahead. I think you had some thoughts here.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, we've had conversations with Brian about kind of his thinking and getting his guidance around, his perspective on through-year models and what makes the most sense. These have been informal conversations, so, please don't, if I misconstrue what you said, it's totally my fault. But I do think it's really important that we continue to get feedback from the field about how we go about any of our models. And I think, to Jeff's point, there is something to be said about semantics for certain. And I think that ultimately we want to get to a place of providing the most valuable information that actually impacts student outcomes. So what does that mean? What outcomes are we talking about? Are we looking to actually provide more programmatic evaluative information to understand what's going on in the context of a student, in the context of the whole environment. And these are the kinds of things that generally as a company we're looking at really striving towards. That said, I think the more we hear from folks like Brian and others, I think the better we will all be able to address the concerns, not only in Nebraska, but in other places. So I hope that folks, continue to watch Brian's blogs. He's had a couple now since that first one. And, I think it's great that we have that kind of relationship with the TAC members, as well as others in the field to keep us guided in the right direction. So more heads and all.
Thanks,
And
Karen.
the closing thing, Chad and others, the more you can kind of, like I said before, visualize what the score reports are going to look like. What kind of, information, what new information will be reported over what's currently reported with MAP. Then we can begin to better evaluate, the strength of that information, where it's coming from, and the technical challenges of providing it and the options for providing it. But, it's sort of like knowing where you're going. And the more we can define that, I think the better we can help you make decisions along the road in terms of the methodology for getting there.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that's a great point. And Jeremy, as you consider, you and the team there at NDE consider all the various factors, content, psychometric, political, communication, all those things. When you get closer to what you think some of those models might look like, I think a useful activity is similar to, and Jeff was mentioning the score reports, it was reminding me of a number of years ago during an evaluation project, Ron Hamilton and April Zniski did some focus groups where they put score reports out in front of intended stakeholders just to kind of say, okay, how would you interpret this? And to determine whether or not they made the right sort of interpretation. And so I think putting, something like that, or putting forth even some straw man models, and then saying, okay, Cindy and Linda, how would you break this? How would the field interpret this? How would your constituents look at this? And then obviously Jeff and Bob and I can kind of help on some of the measurement and policy side of it. But that field input that Karen mentioned, I think, is just really critical.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And know that NWA has already been working with Learning Heroes to dig into some of those reporting pieces and get feedback from parents and stakeholders already about some of the pieces they've been working on. So but it's always a valuable consideration on how putting it in the stakeholders' hands and then getting information about how they see it is always very important.
Any other thoughts, comments, reactions?
I did have one quick thought about if the RIT score is influenced by the additional items, but the proficiency level isn't. People will notice if students with the same RIT score end up at different proficiency levels. So that would be something to watch for, because there you'd get pushback and it would hurt the credibility of the assessment if that happened. Because it'll be hard to explain that to people.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay. I think the last topic then, Jeremy, on the agenda was just our next meeting, which I think Stacy had sent out doodle poll. I get a lot of those, so I might be getting confused, but I think we have one scheduled for next month sometime.
Yeah, we have one scheduled for May. I don't even remember when it is.
May 27th.
That's what I was going to say. May 27th.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah, there we go.
They are correct.
If it's not today, I'm not sure that I know about it. No, I mean, next week. If it's not next week, I don't know about it. But yeah. So May, we're going to be looking at simulations and maybe some other topics as well. If you volunteered to do some of those working sessions, expect to get some additional reach out to you TAC members about the possibility of doing some of those additional working sessions around those simulations. So I know somebody from NWA will probably be reaching out to schedule those pieces.
And the 27th, it starts at noon instead of 11, correct?
It does, yep.
Okay.
Now that I've found it on my calendar.
Excellent. Okay. Jeremy, unless there's anything else that you are needing right now, I think we've made it through our agenda.
Yeah.
Appreciate everybody's time and attentiveness to the topics today. Obviously, very exciting times for you guys in Nebraska on this, and we're happy to be part of the conversation and hopefully contributing a little bit to it.
We appreciate your thoughtfulness and your questions. It really is helpful as we continue to move forward.
Excellent. Okay. With that, thank you, colleagues from NWA, for your presentations and thoughts today. And members of the TAC, thank you all as well. Jeremy, thanks to you and the department team for getting those materials again to us in advance. And we will look forward to our next meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
I appreciate your time. Thanks for your input.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.